So you know Bobby Kennedy pretty well.
Sure.
You've been advising both him and the Trump campaign. What is your take on them combining forces?
Yeah, I just want to say this from my very small vantage point, is that this was not about horse trading. This was not about, kind of polling. This was hours and hours of true emotional connection on what I think they've both talked about, like what issue could be more important? What issue could be more important that a child born today is going to live shorter than their parents right now in America? What issue is more important that, this epidemic rate of mental health issues and chronic disease among kids? We are truly, when you look at the stats, poisoning our population. And it's because of these forces that have propelled, I think, President Trump's movement. This thing that people can't quite put their finger on, but there's dark forces against us and there's institutions that are failing. Again, from my small vantage point, all I can say is there was true bonding on that issue and a desire to put this existential topic more at the top of the national conversation. No real deals or horse trading. It was really just a bond over that. And I think you've seen that happening over the past couple of days.
Yeah, it's Make America Healthy Again. In our final segment here, I want to dive into what does that look like in policy? Right. What can be done? There's one thing you mentioned on Tucker's show that I'm not crazy about: national emergency, because I think it gives too much power to the federal. So you got to convince me on that. So, Calley, what can be done, and maybe address my one concern. The only thing that made me disagree in your segment with Tucker.
Wow, you listened carefully.
And I remember too.
So fundamentally, the framework is stop recommending the crap and stop incentivizing it. And I do think there's a meeting actually with 100 members of Congress with my coalition over the next month, bipartisan. I mean, there's a lot Congress can do, but I'll just give a couple examples of how you just root out this corruption, root out this environment that's profiting for kids being sick. So let me give you an example. 50% of TV news advertising budget comes from the pharmaceutical industry. So the reason you listen to Joe Rogan, you listen to your podcast, they're talking about kids being sick. They're talking about what to eat. They're talking about how to exercise correctly. This is what Americans actually want to talk about.
There it is right there. Literally there's a drug commercial on there.
Not a single segment on the mainstream news about the fact that 33% of kids have prediabetes. And then, of course, COVID, was all about a pharmaceutical solution instead of the fact that this was preying on our immune systems. There's not a bigger issue than the obesity and chronic disease crisis among kids, but the reason they don't talk about it is obvious, because they're paid for by pharma. With one stroke of a pen, just as Reagan initiated D2C advertising, we can not be the only country in the world that... Does
it require legislative?
No, it was an executive order to an FDA department. That was how it's created by Reagan. An amazing president, but I think a mistake on this one. And there's nothing conservative or liberal that the pharmaceutical industry that is a demonstrable fact.
You can make it illegal to advertise?
Day one.
Yeah, and we're the only country that allows it.
And it's a beautiful situation because that's a 90. Yeah, so it's a 90% support that would have at least, and it would cut. Maybe I'm telegraphing too much here, but they're going to freak out. But it would cut 50%. I mean, everyone should be shorting the media stocks.
The media companies would riot too.
They would. They would say it's assault on free speech. But it would be. It would. Could you imagine a more beautiful situation than what they would possibly say?
Would they win in court?
No. I mean, no. I mean, this is an executive order thing, and this is the president.
Oh, I love that.
The president has a lot of constitutional authority, and we get in the state of emergency. The Federalist Papers talked about this. There's several areas, including public health and taking executive authority on military stuff, where the president is endowed with some authority. And if the president sees a public health crisis, like with COVID, a lot of that was executive authority. There's no more important issue in the country right now than the chronic disease crisis, or more urgent.
And this would be undoing something, essentially.
Yeah, it'd be undoing executive order. That's a stroke of a pen.
So if it could be done by executive order, it could be undone by an executive order.
And I'd urge President Biden to do it tomorrow. He should. I mean,
but who would buy all this commercial airtime?
Well, you're advertising great stuff. You're advertising wonderful, but it would not be good for the corporate media.
White noise.
It would not be good for the corporate media.
It's the white noise advertising carousel of Ozempic, and you got to get Allegra, and it's just nonstop.
You could not watch the news or the Olympics without getting a new pharmaceutical product jammed down your face.
Promoted to you by the Olympic athlete.
Simone Biles, unfortunately, it's GLP-1s, right? So So that, as I talked about with Tucker, is not just influence to consumers. That's a way to influence the news itself. By being the largest funder, they're able to call, and this is where it all connects, right? Because they're like, hey, you're criticizing Ozempic, but I got this Harvard study saying Ozempic's perfect. Like this, that's misinformation. So the gravitas of the academic research helps the news censor. So that's number one. Number two, you could tomorrow, with the stroke of a pen, say that the USDA and NIH guideline committees that make guidelines on standards of care and nutrition guidelines can't take members that have conflicts of interest. That sounds like something everyone would assume already happens. That's not true. As I mentioned, 95% of the USDA Nutrition Guideline Committee, 95% of the members take money from food and or pharma companies. Literally, we have a co-opting of the systems. The NIH recently came out during COVID. NIH researchers made $800 million of royalties for COVID era things undisclosed. Everyone sitting at the NIH and the USDA is on the payroll of the industries they're trying to regulate. The FDA, as I mentioned, I can tell you from being in DC, and you know this, bureaucracies are built to grow. How does the FDA grow? They are paid for by pharma. They're not paid for by taxpayers. They are paid for by pharma user fees. They just corrected RFK and I on a stat. We said 50% of their budget comes from pharma. They said it's 47%, and it's actually 75% when you get to actually approving of drugs. So there's a simple set of executive orders, even without this state of emergency, that can be instituted by the president to just start targeting this corruption. And then when you get the science right, you get the children's health right.